The air at the Miller estate auction hung thick and heavy, a mix of late October dust, cheap cigar smoke, and the bittersweet smell of a farm's final breath. Silas Blackwood stood near the back, his hands shoved deep in the pockets of his worn canvas jacket, his knuckles scarred from a lifetime of wrestling with iron. He wasn't here for the household goods or the smaller implements. Most of that was junk, picked over and worn out, much like Old Man Miller himself had been at the end. Silas was here for one thing, a silent, hulking beast that sat apart from the rest, an object of ridicule and pity. It was a Gleaner L2 combine, a monster from another era, or so it seemed. Its once proud silver paint was bleached to a chalky ghost, streaked with long, weeping trails of rust that bled from every bolt and seam. A dark, ugly scorch mark climbed up the side of the engine compartment like a ragged scar. One of the massive front tires was flat, the rubber cracked and split, causing the whole machine to list to the side like a wounded animal. It hadn't moved under its own power in at least 5 years, maybe more. The auctioneer, a fast-talking man named Fitz, hadn't even bothered to list it on the main bill. It was relegated to the end, under the scrap and salvage section. "Look at that thing," a voice drawled, dripping with condescending amusement. Silas's kind of lawn ornament. Silas didn't have to turn to know it was Richard Sterling. Rich was 20 years his junior, with a soft face that had never seen a sunburn and hands that were more familiar with a loan officer's pen than a wrench. He farmed the section next to Silas, but he didn't so much farm it as he commanded it from the air-conditioned cab of a brand-new International Harvester 1466, its red paint so glossy you could see your reflection in it. Sterling was the poster boy for the new way of farming that was sweeping the county in the mid-1970s. Borrow big, buy big, and pray the prices stayed high. Heard Miller cooked the engine, trying to get one last harvest out of it. Another man chuckled, blew a hydraulic line right onto the turbo. Fitz is lucky if he gets scrap price for the weight. Silas ignored them. He kept his eyes on the Gleaner. He'd seen this machine run back before Miller's health failed. It was a good combine, simple in its design compared to the new John Deeres and Internationals. No fancy electronics to go haywire, no complex hydraulic systems that required a factory technician to diagnose. It had a transverse-mounted Alice Chalmers diesel, a big 426 cubic inch six-cylinder with a turbocharger. Easy to work on if you had the space and the patience, and Silas had both. His own farm, 320 acres of the best black dirt in the county, was paid for. His tractor was a 1968 John Deere 4020, a legend he'd rebuilt himself, its diesel engine singing a song of reliability that no new machine could match. He didn't owe a dime to any man or any bank, a fact that seemed to personally offend men like Richard Sterling. Sterling sauntered over, his new boots crunching on the gravel. He clapped a hand on Silas's shoulder, a gesture that was meant to seem friendly, but felt more like a claim of dominance. "Thinking of getting into the scrap business, Silas? Might be more profitable than trying to make a living with that old 2-cylinder museum piece you call a tractor." Silas slowly turned his head, his gaze as steady and unyielding as a fence post set in concrete. "My museum piece starts every morning and doesn't send a bill every month, Rich. Can you say the same for that red beast of yours?" Sterling's smile tightened. "You got to spend money to make money, old man. It's the 1970s. You can't get by with your granddaddy's tools and your granddaddy's thinking. The bank owns my tractor, sure, but that tractor is going to help me buy your land when you finally give up the ghost." The threat hung in the air, sharp and ugly. Silas just gave a slow, deliberate nod. "We'll see." Finally, Fitz moved to the last row. "All right, folks, last lot of the day. This here Gleaner L2 combine. As is, where is. We believe the engine is seized from a fire, but the tires, rims, and a lot of the sheet metal are good. What'll we start the bidding at for the scrap? Give me $500, just for the weight of it. 500? Who'll give me 5? Silence. The farmers shuffled their feet. 500 was a lot to haul away a dead machine that size. You'd spend half of that in fuel and tires just getting it home. 200, Fitz pleaded, his voice losing its rhythm. $200 to haul it away. 100, Silas said, his voice clear and calm, cutting through the murmuring. A few heads turned. Sterling let out a theatrical laugh. He's serious. Silas is buying himself a new scarecrow. Fitz, desperate to be done, latched onto the bid. I got $100 from Mr. Blackwood. Do I hear 150? 150 anywhere? It's worth more than that in steel. No one moved. The combine was a symbol of failure, of Miller's inability to keep up. No one wanted that bad luck on their own place. Sold. Fitz banged his imaginary gavel on his palm. For $100 to Silas Blackwood. Good luck to you, sir. You're going to need it. The laughter from Sterling's group was louder now, unconstrained. Silas ignored it. He walked over to the auctioneer's clerk, pulled 5 worn $20 bills from his wallet and signed the receipt. He now owned a £20,000 problem. As he walked toward the machine, the men parted for him. Some with pity in their eyes, others with open mockery. He ran a calloused hand over the blistered paint on the engine cover. It was hot to the touch, even after all these years, as if the memory of the fire was still trapped in the steel. He knew what they didn't. Old man Miller was meticulous about maintenance, almost to a fault. He'd bet his last dollar that the fire, while damaging, hadn't been catastrophic. And a seized engine. Well, there were different kinds of seized. There was thrown rod, busted crankshaft seized, and then there was heat and rust seized. Silas was betting on the latter. He was betting on his own 2 hands against Richard Sterling's bank loan. It was a gamble he was willing to take. Now, before I tell you what Silas found when he finally got that big Alice Chalmers engine opened up back at his workshop, I want to ask you something. Have any of you ever dragged home a piece of equipment that everybody else swore was pure scrap? A tractor left for dead in a fence row, a baler that had been through a barn fire, an old truck with a seized motor. Drop a comment below and tell me what it was, and whether the scoffers were right, or if you managed to prove them all wrong. I'd love to hear your stories. All right, let's get back to Silas and his £20,000 headache. Getting the Gleaner home was an ordeal in itself. He had to hire a heavy-haul truck, which cost him another $200, more than twice what he'd paid for the machine. The driver, a cynical man with a stained t-shirt, shook his head the entire time they were winching it onto the lowboy trailer. You know, for $300, he grumbled, you could have just bought a pile of scrap metal and had it delivered. Would have saved me the trouble. Silas just pointed to where he wanted it set down, right in the wide open space between his barn and his machine shed. For 2 weeks, it just sat there, an immense silver and rust monument to what the rest of the county saw as his foolishness. Cars would slow down on the county road as they passed, the drivers pointing. Richard Sterling made it a point to drive his new pickup by every evening on his way home from the diner, sometimes giving a sarcastic little toot of his horn. Silas paid them no mind. He was finishing up his fall tillage, pulling his 4-bottom Oliver plough with the 40-20, turning over the rich soil in long, perfect furrows. The work settled him, the familiar rhythm of the diesel engine, a comforting drone against the whispers and the laughter. The 40-20 was a testament to his philosophy. He'd bought it 10 years ago with a cracked block and a spun bearing, paid pennies on the dollar for it. He'd spent a whole winter in his shop, meticulously rebuilding the 404 cubic inch engine, machining what he could, ordering what he couldn't. Now it ran better than new. A simple, powerful machine that he understood down to the last bolt. That combine, he told himself, would be the same. When the first hard frost finally put an end to the fieldwork, the real work began. The first order of business was the engine. He pressure-washed decades of grease, dirt and chaff off the Alice Chalmers block, revealing the extent of the fire damage. The hydraulic line had indeed burst, spraying hot fluid all over the exhaust manifold and the turbocharger. The paint was gone, the wiring was a melted, brittle mess, and all the rubber hoses were cooked to charcoal. It was ugly, but it looked superficial. The real question was what lay inside. He put a 4-foot breaker bar on the front crankshaft bolt and leaned into it with all his weight. The bar bowed, the steel groaning under the strain, but the engine didn't budge. Not 1/1000th of an inch. It was locked up tighter than a banker's fist. Sterling and his friends would have called the scrapyard right then. Silas just grunted and went to get his tools. He pulled the injectors first, one by one, labeling them carefully. Then he poured a mixture he'd concocted himself, half automatic transmission fluid, half acetone, down into each of the 6 cylinders. The pungent chemical smell filled the cold November air. He'd let it soak, let it creep down past the piston rings, let it try to break the bond of rust and carbon that held his engine hostage. For a week, he did this every morning and every evening, adding more of his secret sauce and tapping the side of the engine block with a ball-peen hammer, hoping the vibrations would help the fluid penetrate. The community's scorn was a constant low-grade fever. At the co-op, buying filters and oil, he'd overhear the whispers, still trying to raise the dead over at his place. At the diner, the waitress, a kind woman named Mary, would give him a sympathetic look. "Don't you pay them any mind, Silas," she'd say, refilling his coffee. "They're just jealous you don't owe your soul to the bank like they do." But the scorn intensified when Sterling bought the 40 acres on Miller's North Field, right across the road from where the Gleaner sat. Sterling made a big show of it, bringing in bulldozers to clear the fence rows, a tiling machine to lay new drainage. He was expanding, modernizing, while Silas was wrestling with a dead engine. The contrast couldn't have been starker. One evening, Sterling pulled his pickup into Silas's lane. "Still playing with your toys, I see," he called out from the cab, a smug grin on his face. Silas was wiping grease from his hands with a rag, his face grim. "Still paying the bank's bills, I see." Sterling's grin vanished. "You know, I just closed on the Miller 40. Paid top dollar. Land values are going through the roof. You're sitting on a gold mine here, Silas, and you're wasting your time on this pile of junk. You could sell out, move to town, live like a king." "This land was my father's, and his father's before him," Silas said, his voice low and hard. "It's not for sale, not to you, not to anyone, and this pile of junk is going to run again." "Sure it is," Sterling sneered, rolling up his window. "And maybe the price of corn will hit $5 a bushel." He laughed as he spun his tires in Silas's gravel and sped away. The statement was meant as the height of absurdity. After a week of soaking, Silas tried the breaker bar again. He put the long pipe on the handle for more leverage and pulled. There was a groan, then a sharp crack that echoed across the yard. For a heart-stopping moment, he thought he'd broken the crankshaft. But then it moved. Just a fraction of an inch, but it moved. He let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. It wasn't a catastrophic failure. It was just rust, stubborn, unforgiving rust, but rust was a problem he could solve. It took him the rest of the winter. He had to pull the cylinder head, a massive chunk of cast iron that took his engine hoist and every ounce of his strength to lift. The sight inside was daunting. The cylinder walls were streaked with rust where water had seeped in through the exhaust. 2 of the pistons were completely frozen in their bores. It would all have to come apart. Piece by painstaking piece, he disassembled the entire 670T diesel engine. He laid out every part on his workbench in perfect order. The pistons, the rods, the main bearings, the camshaft, the timing gears. He measured everything with his micrometers and calipers, comparing the numbers to the specifications in the worn service manual he'd managed to find. The crankshaft was still true, the camshaft lobes within tolerance, the core of the engine was good. It was the heart of the beast, and it was still strong. He ordered a complete in-frame overhaul kit, new sleeves, pistons, rings, and a full gasket set. It cost him nearly $800, a significant sum that he paid for by selling a few of his best yearling steers. It was a painful check to write, and it set the gossips' tongues wagging again. "Heard Silas sold his seed stock to pay for parts for that junker," they'd say. "Eating his own future, he is." Silas didn't care. As the snows of winter melted into the mud of spring, he began the slow, methodical process of resurrection. He honed the cylinder bores until they were clean and smooth. He carefully installed the new wet sleeves, pressing them into place. He fitted the new rings onto the new pistons, checking the gap on each one, then used a ring compressor to gently slide each piston and connecting rod assembly back into the engine, torquing the rod bolts to the exact foot-pound specification. It was a sacred ritual, a slow dance of metal and oil and precision. He was breathing life back into the iron, one perfectly torqued bolt at a time. By the time the corn was knee-high in Richard Sterling's freshly tiled fields, Silas had the engine back together, He'd rewired the whole machine, replaced every burned hose, and rebuilt the turbocharger on his workbench. The day he was ready to try and start it, the air was still and humid. He bled the fuel lines, checked the oil, and filled the radiator. He climbed up into the dusty cab, turned the key, and hit the starter button. The big engine turned over slowly, groaning, then faster. White smoke puffed from the exhaust stack, then grey, then a thick, angry cloud of black. It coughed, sputtered, and then with a deafening roar, the Alice Chalmers 670T diesel engine fired and caught. It settled into a rough, shaking idle, blowing years of rust and carbon and doubt out of its iron lungs. Silas sat in the cab, a slow, rare smile spreading across his face. The sound was rough, but it was the most beautiful music he had ever heard. The late 1970s roared in like a freight train. The price of corn, which Sterling had scoffed, would never hit $5, flirted with $4. Soybeans were even better. An intoxicating wave of prosperity washed over the heartland. It was, everyone said, a new golden age for the American farmer. Land that had sold for $500 an acre 5 years ago was now fetching $2,000, then $3,000. The banks, flush with cash from overseas oil money, were practically begging farmers to take out loans. The mantra from the universities and the government was simple: get big or get out. Richard Sterling became the living embodiment of that mantra. He was no longer just farming, he was building an empire on borrowed money. The profits from his high-priced corn were immediately leveraged into more land. He bought the 80 acres south of Silas, then the 160 to the west. He was farming nearly 1,000 acres now, all of it financed with variable-rate loans that seemed like a stroke of genius with the economy booming. His machinery grew along with his acreage. The 1466 was traded in for a massive articulated Steiger Panther III, a four-wheel-drive behemoth that could pull a 12-bottom plow. He bought a brand-new John Deere 7720 turbo combine, complete with a grain monitor and a stereo in the cab. He built a new, sprawling ranch house on a hill overlooking his land and Silas's, and erected a 100 by 200-foot machine shed that dwarfed Silas's old red barn. At the county fair, he was hailed as a visionary, the future of agriculture. And Silas was seen as a relic, a stubborn fool who was letting the opportunity of a lifetime pass him by. He watched Sterling's empire grow from his own modest 320 acres. He had the Gleaner running now, and running well. He'd spent the summer fine-tuning it, calibrating the cylinder speed, adjusting the sieves. He even gave it a fresh coat of silver paint. Not a perfect factory finish, but a good, honest coat of paint that covered the scorch marks and the rust. When harvest came, the contrast was almost comical. Sterling's brand-new John Deere, with its flashing lights and clean green paint, would be working day and night, serviced by a fleet of grain trucks. Across the fence, Silas would be chugging along in his Resurrected Gleaner. The machine was massive overkill for his small acreage. He could harvest all of his corn in 2 good days. His neighbors, even the friendly ones, would shake their heads. Look at him, they'd say. Could have bought the 80 next to him for a song 5 years ago. Could be a rich man right now. Instead, he's polishing up that old piece of junk. The pressure to conform was immense. The banker, Mr. Henderson, even paid him a personal visit one afternoon. He found Silas in his shop, fabricating a new rock guard for the Gleaner's header. Silas, Henderson began, looking around the tidy but old-fashioned shop. I've been looking at your accounts. You're in a unique position. You have 0 debt. With your land as collateral, I could get you a line of credit for $1 million by tomorrow morning. You could buy out the old Henderson farm before it even hits the market. You could have a setup just like Rich Sterling's. Silas wiped his hands on a rag and looked the banker in the eye. And what's the interest rate on that $1 million bill? Well, it's a bit high right now, around 12%, Henderson admitted, but it's variable. It'll come back down. The main thing is to secure the land while it's available. You have to expand. 12%, Silas repeated softly, shaking his head. My father told me to never borrow money at a rate higher than you can guarantee a return. The price of corn is high now, but it won't be forever. What happens when the price drops and that rate goes up? Henderson sighed, a look of pity on his face. "Silas, you're a good man, but you're thinking like it's 1950. This is a new economy. It's different now." "Debt is still debt, Bill," Silas said, turning back to his work. "And I prefer to sleep at night." Silas continued on his own path. He took his profits from the good years and, instead of buying more land, he improved what he had. He re-roofed his barn. He bought a used but solid gravity wagon to go with his combine. He paid cash for everything. He kept his operating loan at the bank to a bare minimum, just enough for seed and fuel, and paid it off the day his grain check cleared. In an era of rampant debt-fueled expansion, Silas Blackwood was an island of fiscal sanity, and for that he was considered a failure. He was the man who refused to become a king. One evening in the fall of 1979, Silas was in his house, listening to the radio as he cleaned his supper dishes. The local news was on, followed by the national report. A man's stern voice came on, talking about inflation, about the Federal Reserve. He mentioned the new chairman, a man named Paul Volcker, who was determined to break the back of inflation by aggressively raising interest rates. The prime rate, the reporter said, had just hit 15%. A cold knot tightened in Silas's stomach. He'd seen this before, on a smaller scale. He remembered his grandfather's stories of the Depression. Easy credit always came with a price. The next day at the diner, Richard Sterling was holding court in his usual booth, laughing and bragging. "Just closed on another 160 acres, he announced to the room. "Got it on a variable rate. The bank is practically giving money away." Someone mentioned the news about the interest rates. Sterling waved a dismissive hand. "Ah, that's just city talk. Politics. It won't affect us out here. Corn's still over $3. As long as the price holds, we can handle a few points on the interest. You got to be aggressive to win." Silas sat at the counter, sipping his coffee. He watched Sterling, saw the easy confidence, the unshakable belief that the good times would never end. He looked out the window at the blue autumn sky, but all he could see were storm clouds gathering on the horizon, clouds that only he seemed to notice. The harvest was in, the bins were full, but Silas had a feeling a different kind of reaping was about to begin. The first sign of trouble wasn't a drought or a hailstorm. It was a voice on the radio in the winter of 1980. Silas was in his workshop, grinding a new edge on a plowshare, when the news came through the static. President Carter, furious over the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, had announced a grain embargo. The market, which had been the foundation of everyone's prosperity, collapsed overnight. The price of corn plummeted from over $3 a bushel to barely $2. At the co-op, the mood was funereal. Men who had been planning new pickups and family vacations now stood in grim, silent groups, staring at the tumbling numbers on the ticker. Richard Sterling was there, his usual bravado replaced by a brittle anger. "It's temporary," he insisted, his voice a little too loud. "Politics. They'll sort it out. The world needs our grain. The price will come back, you'll see." But it didn't, and as the price of corn stayed stubbornly low, the other shoe dropped. The letters from the bank started arriving in mailboxes all over the county. The prime interest rate, which had seemed a distant problem for Wall Street financiers, was now a brutal reality. 12% became 15, then 18. For farmers like Sterling, who had leveraged every asset on variable rate loans, it was a catastrophe. His monthly interest payments doubled, then tripled, transforming from a manageable expense into a ravenous monster that was eating his equity alive. Silas felt the squeeze too. The low price of corn meant his own profits were thin, but they were still profits. His only debt was his small operating note for seed and fuel, which he paid off as always after selling his grain. He wasn't getting rich, but he wasn't going backward. He watched his neighbors, saw the worry etched into their faces, the new lines of strain around their eyes. He saw Sterling's brand-new Steiger Panther tearing through the fields that spring, working from sunup to sundown, as if sheer horsepower could outrun the numbers on a banker's ledger. The real turning point came that fall, during soybean harvest. The weather was perfect, a long stretch of dry, sunny days. Sterling's magnificent John Deere 7720 was chewing through his vast fields, its big diesel engine a constant hum on the horizon. Then, one afternoon, the hum stopped. Silas was in his own field, chugging along in the gleaner, when he noticed the silence. He looked across the fence line and saw the big green combine sitting motionless in the middle of a row. He finished his own pass and drove the gleaner over to the edge of his property. Sterling was standing beside the combine, his hands on his hips, staring up at the silent machine. Even from a distance, Silas could feel the waves of frustration coming off him. "Trouble?" Silas called out, shutting down the gleaner's engine. Sterling kicked one of the massive tires. "You wouldn't believe it." Flashing lights on the console, alarms buzzing. "Says there's a fault in the main hydraulic controller. Thing's got more wires in it than a telephone exchange. I can't even figure out where to start." "Did you call the dealer?" "Yeah," Sterling spat. "They can send a technician out. Tomorrow afternoon. $150 just for the service call, plus $90 an hour after that. He said it's probably the controller board. Special order part. Might take a week to get it in." "A week?" He threw his hands up in despair. "I've got 700 acres of beans left to cut, and rain is in the forecast for this weekend." Silas looked at his own machine. The gleaner was a study in mechanical simplicity. It had levers, belts, and chains. If something broke, you could see it. You could take it apart with a wrench and a hammer, weld it back together, and be running in an hour. Sterling's combine was a technological marvel, but its complexity had become its Achilles heel. It had made him a passenger in his own harvest, completely dependent on a distant technician and a fragile supply chain. "I'll be done with my beans by noon tomorrow," Silas said quietly. "If you want, I can come over and help you get a few more acres in before the rain." Sterling stared at him, his face a mixture of shock, humiliation, and disbelief. He looked at the gleaner, the machine he had openly mocked, its silver paint gleaming in the afternoon sun. He looked at his own state-of-the-art combine, silent and useless. The offer was an act of profound grace, but for a man like Sterling, it felt like the bitterest charity. "No," he finally said, his voice tight with pride. "No, I'll figure it out." Silas just nodded. "All right. The offer stands." He fired up the big Alice Chalmers diesel and went back to his work. The rain came that Saturday, a hard, driving rain that lasted for 3 days. Silas's beans were safe in the bin, Sterling's were still in the field, the pods swelling and splitting, the harvest loss mounting with every passing hour. The cracks in Richard Sterling's empire were no longer invisible. They were splitting wide open for the entire county to see. The crisis, when it fully arrived, was not a sudden flood, but a slow, grinding glacier of economic despair. By 1982, the farm economy was in a full-blown depression. Interest rates peaked at a soul-crushing 21%. Land values, which had been the paper foundation of so much wealth, collapsed by more than half. The prosperity of the 70s was revealed to be a phantom, a fever dream of easy credit and inflated assets. The signs were everywhere. Red and white foreclosure notices began to appear, tacked to fence posts at the end of farm lanes, like grim proclamations. The auction bills posted at the co-op and the post office, once filled with the cheerful notices of retirees selling out, were now dominated by the stark, black-bordered announcements of bank sales. Families that had farmed the same ground for 100 years were being forced off their land. The local paper was filled with stories of heartbreak and desperation. It was a quiet, rural tragedy, played out in hushed conversations at the diner and tearful meetings in the cold, impersonal offices of the farmer's home administration. Richard Sterling's fall was the most spectacular of all. His vast, leveraged empire was perfectly designed to fail in this new reality. The high interest rates devoured his cash flow, and the collapsing land values erased his collateral. The bank, which had once courted him as a visionary, now saw him as a liability. They called his notes. The day of the Sterling auction was cold and grey, a miserable day in early March that matched the mood of the crowd. It was held on his farm, in the shadow of the massive machine shed he had built with the bank's money. The crowd was different from the one at the Miller auction years before. There was no laughter, no good-natured ribbing. The faces were somber, haunted. These were not just neighbors and buyers, they were pallbearers at the funeral of a dream. Many of them were facing the same fate as Sterling, their own day of reckoning just a few months or a bad harvest away. Silas was there, standing near the back, just as he had been at the Miller sale. He wasn't there to gloat or to bargain hunt. He was there to bear witness. The auctioneer, the same fast-talking Fitz, seemed subdued. His usual patter lacked its energy. He moved quickly through the smaller items, the tools, the shop equipment. Then came the big machinery. The John Deere 7720, less than 5 years old, sold for a third of what Sterling had paid for it. The planter, the disc, the field cultivator, all went for pennies on the dollar. Then they brought out the flagship, the Steiger Panther III. It was an awesome machine, a symbol of the power and ambition that had defined the era. Sterling had polished it for the sale, its green paint gleaming even under the flat grey sky. "All right, folks, here she is," Fitz called out, trying to muster some enthusiasm. The big cat herself. 4-wheel drive, 300 horsepower, thousands of acres of life left in her. "What'll you give me?" The opening bid was shockingly low. The bidding was sluggish, hesitant. The machine represented a kind of farming that no one could afford anymore. It was too big, too thirsty for fuel, and too expensive to repair. In the end, it sold to a large corporate farm from 2 counties over for less than the price of a new pickup truck. Silas saw Sterling standing alone by the corner of the house his father had built, the house he was about to lose. He was no longer the confident, swaggering man who had mocked Silas's old-fashioned ways. He looked 10 years older, his shoulders slumped, his face pale and drawn. He was watching the dismemberment of his entire life, piece by piece. Silas's own survival had become a quiet legend in the county. While his neighbors were struggling to make interest payments, he was secure. His harvest from the gleaner, though modest, was all his. His fuel and seed were his only costs. He had enough to live on, to maintain his equipment, and to put a little aside. In a landscape of financial ruin, his simple, debt-free existence was the ultimate form of wealth. He had weathered the storm not by being bigger or smarter, but by being smaller and more resilient. His granddaddy's thinking, which Sterling had once mocked, had proven to be the most modern and wisest philosophy of all. The last item to be sold was the land itself, parceled out to the highest bidder. The big tracts Sterling had bought on credit were gobbled up by the bank and outside investors. Finally, they came to the original home quarter section, the 160 acres that had been in the Sterling family for 3 generations. It included the house, the barn, and the new machine shed. The bidding was slow, no one had the money or the heart for it. The banker, Mr. Henderson, stood beside the auctioneer, his face grim. He needed to recoup what he could for the bank. "I have an opening bid of $40,000, Fitz announced. It was a tragically low number, less than $400 an acre for prime land with a full set of buildings. Silence. No one moved. Then a clear voice cut through the cold air. $50,000. Every head turned. It was Silas Blackwood. A murmur went through the crowd. Henderson looked over at Silas, his expression unreadable. Sterling, hearing the voice, looked up from the ground, his eyes wide with disbelief. "I have 50,000 from Mr. Blackwood," Fitz said, a flicker of life returning to his voice. "Do I hear 55? There were no other bids. The land was worth more, but no one could or would bid against Silas. It was as if they all understood that something more than a simple transaction was taking place. "Sold," Fitz cried, his gavel falling with a sharp crack, "for $50,000 to Silas Blackwood." Silas didn't walk up to the clerk's table right away. Instead, he walked slowly across the muddy yard, his boots making soft sucking sounds in the damp earth. He walked right up to Richard Sterling. The younger man flinched, expecting a final crushing blow of humiliation, a lecture on the folly of his ways. Silas stopped in front of him. He looked at the house, the barn, the land. "This is good ground, Rich," he said, his voice quiet. "Your father was a good farmer. He took care of it." Sterling couldn't speak. He just nodded, his throat working. "I don't want your land," Silas continued. "I've got all I can handle, but I don't want to see it go to some corporation from out of state either." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper and a pen. It was a blank rental agreement. "I'll rent it back to you, a third of the crop, just like the old days. You farm it, you live in the house, you use the shed. You get back on your feet." Sterling stared at the paper, then at Silas's face, searching for the trick, the angle. He found none. He saw only a quiet, plain-spoken sincerity. "Why?" he finally choked out. "After everything. All the things I said." Because we're neighbors, Silas said simply, and because my father taught me that a man's worth isn't measured by the size of his wallet, but by the strength of his character. You made a mistake. You listened to the wrong people. But you're a good farmer, and this is where you belong. Tears welled in Sterling's eyes, hot tears of shame, gratitude, and overwhelming relief. He took the paper from Silas's calloused hand. For the first time in years, someone had offered him not a loan, but a lifeline. The years that followed were lean, but they were healing. The farm crisis slowly receded, leaving deep scars on the community, but also a hard-won wisdom. The talk at the diner changed. The bragging about new equipment and rising land values was replaced by talk of fixing old machinery, of crop rotation, of paying down debt. The men who had once mocked Silas now sought his advice. They'd stop by his shop, a broken part in their hand, and ask him how he might fix it. He never turned anyone away. He became the quiet, unofficial elder of the township, his wisdom valued more than any banker's. Richard Sterling worked the home farm as Silas's tenant for 5 years. He sold the big new house he'd built and moved his family back into the old farmhouse. He learned to get by with smaller, older equipment. He learned the difference between want and need. He and Silas never became close friends, but a deep, unspoken respect grew between them. On the 5th year, Silas sold the farm back to him on a contract for deed. With fair terms and 0 interest, he was giving Sterling not just his land back, but his dignity. Time rolled on. The 1980s gave way to the 90s. Silas grew older, his hair turning the same silver as his old gleaner. His hands were gnarled with arthritis, but they could still feel the right tension on a bolt. He never expanded his 320 acres. It was enough. He had a grandson, a boy named Jake, who spent every possible moment on the farm. Jake didn't have posters of sports heroes on his bedroom wall. He had diagrams of diesel engines and hydraulic systems. He learned at his grandfather's side, handing him wrenches, listening to his stories. One crisp autumn afternoon, when Jake was 16, he was helping Silas get the old gleaner ready for storage after the harvest. They didn't use it much anymore. A neighbor with a newer machine would custom harvest Silas's corn for a share of the crop. But Silas refused to sell the L2. He kept it in the shed, clean and greased, a monument of silver steel. "Grandpa," Jake asked, wiping grease from a Zerk fitting, "why didn't you ever get big? Like Mr. Sterling tried to. You could have. You could have owned half the county." Silas stopped what he was doing and looked at the boy. He walked over and placed a heavy hand on the gleaner's massive front tire. The rubber was still good. "Look at this machine, Jake," he said, his voice a low rumble. "When I bought it, everyone said it was scrap, worthless. They said I was a fool for wasting my time on it. They were all out borrowing money to buy new, shiny things. They were buying a payment. They were buying debt." He patted the cold steel of the combine's body. "I wasn't buying a combine. I was buying freedom. This machine never sent me a bill. It never charged me interest. It asked for nothing but my own 2 hands, my time and my patience. Everything it gave me, every bushel of corn it shelled, every dollar it earned, was mine. It didn't belong to any bank." He looked out the big shed door, across his fields, where the corn stubble shone gold in the late afternoon sun. The John Deere 4020, still his main tractor, was parked by the barn, its familiar green paint faded but honest. "There's 2 kinds of rich in this world, son," Silas said, turning back to his grandson. "There's the kind that looks rich, with new trucks and big houses and land you can't see the end of. But that kind of rich is usually just a paint job over a mountain of debt. It's fragile. A little bad weather, a little bad luck, and it all comes crashing down." He smiled, a slow, deep smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. "Then there's the other kind of rich. It's the feeling of putting your seed in the ground, knowing you own that ground. It's the peace of mind you get from knowing that the machines in your shed are yours, free and clear. It's sleeping soundly at night, no matter what the interest rates are doing. It's about being the master of your own life, not a servant to a loan." He handed the grease gun to Jake. "Never bet the farm, boy. Never borrow more than you can pay back in a bad year. And remember that the most valuable tools you'll ever own," he said, holding up his own scarred, capable hands, "are these. Don't you ever forget that." Jake nodded, the words sinking in, taking root. He looked at the massive old combine, and for the first time, he didn't see an obsolete piece of machinery. He saw a legacy. He saw wisdom forged in steel. He saw the quiet, unshakable truth of his grandfather's life. A truth that would outlast any boom and survive any bust, as solid and enduring as the black dirt beneath their feet.